Bob, you've written a lot of books about the Revolutionary War, and I know that you are sometimes referred to as the Revolutionary Detective. Why is that?
Well, I have a personal interest in the war. It's in my genes. Actually, I had an ancestor, my third great-grandfather, who spent 8 years in the Continental Army. He was at Yorktown, he was on the Canadian campaign, he was on the Clinton-Sullivan campaign, he wintered at Jockey Hollow, and I followed his life and I wrote his biography. So when I hear these drums today, it does something to me personally, very stirring. John Allison is standing by my side. And I've just written a new book. It's my fourth book, actually. And it's about the common soldiers in George Washington's army. It's called Searching for Yankee Doodle.
And what does the name come from? Who's Yankee Doodle?
Well, Yankee Doodle was a slang term that was used first by the British to make fun of our troops who were ragged and tattered. But it grew to be a badge of honor. And the American troops themselves called themselves Yankee Doodles. It's derived from an Old English term. The book, I wrote the book because for 200 years, the American public had a mistaken opinion of what the common soldier of the Revolutionary was. They had a wrong description. Their description, which I call the golden myth, was intensely patriotic men, citizen soldiers, part-time soldiers, leaving their plows and running off and running back and starting the plows and putting their muskets back in the fireplace, and driven solely by patriotism and protecting their homes. But that was wrong.
Really?
When I began to research it, along with several other historians, coincidentally at the same time, in about the 1970s, early 1980s, there were about 5 of us in different parts of the country who researched and followed who these men were. And we came up with something surprising. They weren't intensely patriotic to a large extent. There was always a big degree of patriotism ran through what they did. We have an entirely new army coming in 1776, and it's poor men, transient workers, farm laborers from the bottom of the socioeconomic scale of the male population of America. They were landless people. They were not yeoman farmers. They were the Continental soldiers that carried us through the war. They were called war men, and they were the men that won the war. There was a lot of low-level craftsmen in there, but they were transients. They were right off the boat, some of them. There were a lot of Scotch-Irish who came over from Great Britain. They hated the British and they were poor, so they made excellent soldiers.
If I were to shove this microphone into one of their faces during a battle, why would they say they were fighting?
Well, they probably would say they're fighting for God and country. Because that was instilled in them. The Revolutionary War was commissioned by God. That was the public message. The ladies at home would not date non-patriotic men. What did matter to them is that they would visit strange lands. They were in it for the excitement. They were farm boys who had never even been to the next village. And they would be traveling through strange lands. They would be making new friends. They craved the sting of battle because it was excitement. And besides, there were economic reasons. The food, the pay, and the shelter, which they never got. The promises were broken the minute they joined. They were broken. They were sent off to battle without weapons, a lot of them. So that kind of goes through the range of motivation. At the beginning of the war, we had a lot of great things happen. First of all, Lexington and Concord. We drove the British. We attacked the British line at Lexington. We lost the Battle of Bunker Hill, but it was a Pyrrhic victory for the British because they lost. Their losses were very heavy. After that, we took Fort Ticonderoga with a bunch of ragged guys from New England who went over there and took the strongest bastion on a chain of lakes that ran from the Hudson River to the St. Lawrence. And then we invaded Canada. We were we're talking 1775. By the time April 1775 was Lexington and Concord. The invasion of Canada started in like June. Just a few, us invading this big country because we perceived that it was lightly defended. We perceived that the people up there were French and were conquered and they would come over to us. None of that happened, and it was a terrible, gruesome defeat. Washington sat down and he said, I have the wrong army here. These people are going home. They've enlisted for 3, 4, 5, 6 months. And when their enlistment is over, they're walking away, regardless of the battle. Rampant desertions, and these people were leaving for a good reason. Their families were starving. They had to bring in the harvest. Their families wouldn't have made it through the winter if they didn't go home. The Revolutionary War was a horrible war, and as a veteran, I appreciate what those men went through. You know, we say we're combat veterans. That's a special kind of veteran. But combat to a lot of us, very candidly, meant calling in naval gunfire, airstrikes, and artillery on a bunch of specks on the horizon. These people stood toe-to-toe, typically in open ranks, 50 yards apart, and fired point blank into one another. And when one rank broke on the other side, there was a bayonet charge. The bayonet was the M16 of the Revolutionary War. That was really combat. And next to World War II, percentage-wise, there were more people killed in the Revolutionary War than in any other war.
And these soldiers, many of them at the lower levels, was this the first military experience and the first battles they've ever fought in?
Absolutely, but early in the war we were annihilated. The Battle of Brandywine, we were just annihilated. We were just a poor bunch of ragged farm boys standing against the finest army in the world, the British regulars, and it was a terrible defeat. And they drove us all the way up. They took our capital of Philadelphia, and they drove us into a camp called Valley Forge, where we spent the winter. And there were just a lot of series of defeats until we came along and surprised them at Trenton.
And what were the final days of the war like for not so much the country, but for the individual soldiers? What were they told? Did they continue to fight? Was there a period of time where they just sort of waited for the peace talks to be over?
Yes. They were up at a place called the New Windsor Cantonment. It's outside of Newburgh, New York. The whole Continental Army was there, and they were restless. They had won the Battle of Yorktown, which it was a decisive battle of the war, but the war wasn't over. And they said, we won the battle, we want to go home. And Washington couldn't let them go because the British had most of the South. They had New York. I think there's something like 30,000 British troops as the peace negotiations were going on in the country. So he couldn't release the army. He kept them there. There were desertions and restlessness. And he built a stockade around the encampment, not to keep out the enemy, but to keep the men in. He hung on them as long as possible, and he wanted to pay them. He had to send them off without pay. The only thing he'd do for them is he gave them their musket, so when they got home they could hunt for food. And they were turned loose under the command of their officers. The officers marched them out of camp when they were discharged. Why? Because the American public feared that the Army would turn around and pillage the countryside and rebel and everything else. So you see people getting discharged from New Windsor, they're marching in ranks, going home. But the veterans were mistreated, they were spurned, a lot of them begged on the streets. And they weren't recognized really until 35 years after the war in 1818 when the Pension Act was declared. And the typical private of the Revolutionary War was in his 60s, and he got $8 a month pension, which was a princely sum in those days.
What about the rest of the Continental Army, the officers and the kind of the mid-level leaders? What happened to them?
They had places to go. The privates had no homes sometimes. Their hometowns, I can't even find them in the census data of their hometowns, which meant they were transients. But the middle-level people and the the top-level officers, landowners, they had a place to go. They resumed their businesses and their plantations. Washington went back to Mount Vernon and became our president, of course, and they became leaders of the new nation. Most of the leaders of the new nation were derived from the officer corps of the Revolutionary War.
What are we doing here today at Monmouth Battlefield Park? What's this all about?
Well, this was the longest battle of the war. It was a huge battle. All the major generals of both sides were here. Washington was coming from Valley Forge after spending a terrible winter there, as most people know. His troops were trained by Baron von Steuben, discipline, linear tactics in the battlefield, so they set out in the spring as a refreshed group, and they moved through Princeton on their way to actually the Hudson Highlands. The British, meanwhile, left Philadelphia and were heading to New York. They converged here in Freehold, New Jersey, then known as Monmouth Courthouse.
And this was a significant battle for a number of reasons. Why?
Well, the most significant part about it, the battle sort of was a draw. There was no winner. But for the first time in history, the ragged farm boys of the Continental Army, trained by Baron von Steuben during the winter, stood toe-to-toe, face-to-face, musket to musket with the British regulars, the finest army in the world, and stood them off and drove them from the field.
And this also enhanced General Washington's image as a leader, didn't it?
Oh yes, yeah. He that established between the Battle of Trenton and the battle here at Monmouth. That established his image in the mind of the country, and it was an image that was faltering too, because he had many defeats at the beginning of the war.
And while it was a draw, the British actually lost a lot of guys to heat exhaustion, right?
They say there was more people died from the heat. It was 107 that day. And the people that were most affected by the heat, curiously enough, were the Hessian soldiers, the mercenaries that worked for the British. A number of them died along the way, even before they got to the battle. But they slept on their arms all night, and it was even hot at night. When they got up in the morning, the British had disappeared. They were on their way to Sandy Hook and on their way to New York, never to come back again.
And then the battle began. Each side took its place, some behind the hedgerow, some behind cannons, and some right out there in the open. There were rolling hills and crops planted in the field, and so it wasn't always easy to take stock of the land or to know exactly where the enemy was located. In a few moments, the crops would be trampled. The cannonballs would hurtle through the air, muskets would explode with anger, bayonets would pierce through the flesh of human beings, and the heat would be more than oppressive. It would be insufferable. These, my friends, were the ancestors who fought for our freedom and would die or be wounded as well. And whether today is an accurate depiction of a specific skirmish within the battle or not, it does provoke a sense of what it must have been like to face a wall of redcoats and see a massive spray of musket balls moving in your direction. So watch and listen and imagine the battle where General George Washington would become a national hero, where young soldiers would gain confidence in fighting future battles, which would eventually lead to America's independence from England. And I can't help but think, as I watch this play, this dramatic interpretation of history unfold, I can't help but think about all the battles we have suffered through to keep our independence. People have died for our freedom. And now at this moment, there are men and women who continue to fight in strange lands, who put their lives at risk and go to sleep, never knowing if they'll live another day. Many of us were born into this cruel, often unfair world where justice often requires violent means. to a peaceful end. But I can't help but wonder if there will ever be an alternative to secure freedom. I love our country, just like most of you, and I think it's okay to be critical of it when it seems to head in the wrong direction. That's what these folks did back in the day to fight for our freedom. But we should never lose sight of those who cannot criticize, but can only aim and fire. We should never keep them from our prayers, just as we should never forget where we came from and all of those men and women who sacrificed so much for us to make the country what it is today. So that's it for the program. You know how it goes. If you see me out there somewhere, please do stop and say hello, because nothing is more important than meeting you. So long, everybody.